to understand the psychology of the perpetrators, you have to understand they were often doing what they thought of as a positive good. Many of the biggest body accounts throughout history were the result of that. They were trying to make a better society. They had positive goals, and violence was just a means of getting rid of other people who were in the way, who were blocked progress. This is what was needed for the revolution, to make the paradise, the socialist paradise on earth, and we had to stop our ears and not give in to bourgeois sensitivity of feeling pity for them. That really captured for me the inner struggle for people who were hurting people by condemning them to starve to death. If you take action, you are responsible. The runaway trolley kills the 5 people, well, that's bad. But if you throw the switch, you would be responsible for the other person's death.
If indeed the free will doesn't exist, what does it mean for the existence of evil?
That's a very ominous trend in our society, and will lead to more.
Do we all have capacity for evil?
Well, yes, I suppose we have the capacity. We are able to choose how to act. Many people do things. Most people don't do things that they think are evil. Much of what's evil is evaluated by other people. When I started writing that book, I started with the classic philosophical question, why is there evil? But gradually evolved into some more complicated questions, like why do some people do things that other people consider evil? And also, why isn't there more evil than there is?
I think the interesting thing about the evil and how it's being perceived by the perpetrator against victim is that, like you said, in the eyes of the perpetrators, what they're doing quite often isn't actually seen as anything evil. There is always an elaborate explanation that justifies their action. But I kind of see the idea that the evil is perceived through the eyes of the victim as being hijacked nowadays, because in a lot of the academia, in a lot of the activist movements, we see that people are purposefully turning themselves into victims and claim that they are being victimized, for example, with things like microaggressions that, objectively speaking, that's not evil, yet through their eyes it is. So how do you sort of consider the fact that the idea, the concept of what evil is, can be hijacked essentially?
Well, I understand one of the basic ideas in economics is that if the government subsidizes something, you get more of it. So many governments have woken up to we need to take care of people who have been victims of various things. And so they do it often with very positive motives, but it ends up subsidizing being a victim. And so more people will claim that status. This is not to diminish their problems or anything, but they do call for more of them. I mean, I wrote that book before all the microaggression stuff came out, which is kind of a new twist on things, that people want to claim that they're being victimized even if no one intended to attack them. Or traditional oppression is pretty clear cut, that people want to attack others and deliberately hurt them or hold them down or take away their possessions and so on. That's fairly straightforward. But now they can say, well, you said something that hurt my feelings, and even though you didn't hurt my feelings, I'm a victim. So there's an expansion in that regard. And there's also the argument that concern about a lot of things gets larger as the problem diminishes. So in the United States, there's lots of talk about racism, and everyone's accusing everyone else of racism. Now, if you go back a couple hundred years, people had very extreme racist views compared to what there's today, but there was no concern about it. Nobody said, "Oh, that's a racist. You shouldn't say that." And now that it's nearly vanishing, at least from conscious, deliberate attitudes and statements by people. My friend John Tierney wrote, "The demand for racism exceeds the supply," and so people have to find ever more subtle ways of finding it to justify their claims to be a victim.
Yeah, I think in the UK it's even more prominent because we pretty much import a lot of the cultural stuff that is happening in the States, and we very much imported the racism and the riots of 2020.
Yes,
And
if I can add something, I talk to evolutionary people. I'm not really an evolutionary psychologist myself, but everything starts with evolution. So I think they have a lot to teach. And sometimes they joke about, well, imagine if a chimpanzee in a group of chimpanzees could convince the others, oh, I'm a victim. Everyone picks on me. People take my food. They beat me up and so on. Well, what would that have? That would just invite all the other chimpanzees to do the same. It would be a terrible, a terrible move, and so no one would do that. But now that we have governments that have a lot of compassion for victims, then it does pay to do that. And again, I'm not diminishing people's real suffering and so on, but it also does attract people with considerably weaker claims than in bygone eras.
the incentive structures there are definitely a little bit twisted. So before we actually start diving in, I would like you to help us understand the concept of evil, because the archetype of evil has persisted throughout millennia. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people would be able to point to an action that they consider evil, but describing it is a little bit less easy. So how would you sort of help people understand evil in like the most helpful way of understanding what it actually is?
All right. Well, getting a precise definition, that's the job of philosophy. I'm a psychologist, social scientist. We're more comfortable with what you call fuzzy sets where the boundaries aren't there. We can go to the main cases and study what causes it. So in my approach, we just looked at why do people do bad things to each other? And it could be all manner. And that way you can also draw on many psychology studies that have small amounts of aggression that certainly don't rise to the level of mass murder or the Holocaust or things that we associate with grand evil. Now, about the archetype, as you called it, yes, I found rather consistent features across multiple domains. It's usually associated with doing deliberate harm, often with enjoying it or doing it for its own sake. There is a secondary meaning of evil traditionally, which is disorder and chaos. So, for example, you look at many horror movies and many scary movies, they'll start with a nice a family having a picnic or something like that, and everything is all in its place, and chaos is about to intrude into their world. So it's the breakdown of order is another feature. So the image of it, which the perpetrator is motivated to do bad things, has no redeeming character. The victim is presented as totally innocent and undeserving. And there certainly are such cases of totally innocent victims there. But I also remember reading a lot of the police reports of murders and so on. And often there's fighting back and forth and deliberate mutual provocations. At the end, you can see who's the victim and who's the perpetrator. The perpetrator is dead. I mean, the perpetrator is being led away in handcuffs and the victim is dead. But if you had stopped the scene 20 minutes earlier, it would have been hard to say who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. One said something and the other said something nastier back, and one gave a shove and the one took a swing at him. So in many cases, the totally innocent victim rule, which is part of the archetype, but is a little bit misleading.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then in terms of the psychology then of evil people, are we talking about the common traits? Are we talking more about the circumstances that they find themselves? Are we talking more about the tools that they use to sort of reframe the situation to be able to perpetrate the evil action.
All of those are legitimate areas of study, and I tried to get at all of them. My concern is what are the roots of it? What are the basic causes? For which there were several. One was just as a means to an end, that people use violence, aggression to get what they want. We shouldn't be totally surprised by that. In nature, social animals have conflicts. They want the same thing, and so, well, the big one gets it. The more aggressive one can predominate. It's in a way how nature solves questions of social conflict. In human society, we've come up with better ways of exchanging money or going to court or getting arbitration or compromise, other sorts of things. But we are animals underneath, and so we shouldn't be surprised that periodically arguments and disputes end in some degree of violence, even over things like what television program to watch. Sometimes people get turned violent over that. Small disputes can escalate into severe ones. So anyway, a means to an end, that's a common one. Another that was a more novel contribution for me was a threatened egotism, wounded pride, it's sometimes called, in some others. There'd been a theory going around in psychology that low self-esteem was a cause of aggression. And so when I started reading, I had done research on self-esteem, and I was a little surprised by this, because the picture of people with low self-esteem that emerged from my studies and the ones other people were doing didn't look like an aggressive person. They're mostly insecure, unsure of themselves. They avoid risks, don't want to take chances, don't want to call attention to themselves. All of that is the opposite to what you do when you start a fight. So I was curious what the evidence was, and I started looking, and I found people would say, oh yes, low self-esteem causes aggression, and they would cite a previous source, but they wouldn't have any evidence for it. So I would go to the previous source. What did they have? Well, they said it too, and they attributed it to somebody else. You follow, it was like going down a rabbit hole or something. There was no evidence that I could find, and no original statement of that idea. It had somehow emerged and caught hold. My impression was the idea had taken hold when, in the 1970s, researchers started talking to women who were victims of domestic violence, and they were, in a way, making excuses for their partner who was violent toward them, saying, oh, he has low self-esteem and so on. But when they actually studied those people, they don't have low self-esteem, they had high self-esteem. What sets them off and starts aggression is if you have a very favorable opinion of yourself and someone else comes along and questions it or challenges it or criticizes it. So, as I said, wounded pride. It's the positive view of self that others don't share. And only some people react aggressively to that. Other people can just sort of laugh it off. I mean, if I don't know, if you went up to Albert Einstein and told him you thought he was stupid, he's not likely to hit you. You would just be making a fool of yourself. But somebody who thinks he's really smart but isn't is very sensitive to that, and then might well lash out. So it's this high self-esteem, but a bit insecure in foundation, or a bit very reliant on what other people validate. Those are the people who respond aggressively to criticism. That's partly the picture of the narcissist, and the personality traits that we characterize violent people now have changed. I don't see low self-esteem mentioned anymore there. They talk about the dark triad of narcissism and psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, which is a sort of manipulative attitude toward other people. Psychopathy is often defined by not having feelings of guilt. So those are the traits. It's the disregard for the other person and the selfish concern for what's good for you.
I think before we turn to the sort of third and the fourth root of evil, I would like to spend a little bit more time in here, because I think self-esteem is one of these buzzwords that people have got an immediate positive association with. The dark side of the self-esteem is quite often in our sort of blind spot. We don't really recognize that there is actually a shadow sort of side to the idea of self-esteem. And when I was talking to Mark Leary, who studied self-esteem, he was essentially saying that the entire term has just completely changed the direction of what it actually is, and that the self-esteem is actually supposed to come from being rooted in confidence, in competence. But right now, what we are doing in this perpetuate sort of making people feel safe and cushy and fuzzy at all times is we are adding that sort of that sense of self-grandiosity when there is really not necessarily the foundation for it. And I think we can see it a lot in a lot of the activist movements, where, you know, people are going to be saying that they are all for the oppressed, they are all for the freedom and people that can't speak, and yet those are the people that will lash out on other people that are speaking about issues that they class as morally repugnant. So there is something about the way that we are currently just inflating people's self-esteem without actually the foundations there, that I think might just... Are we breeding a little bit more narcissism than there should be in the population? Like, are we pushing more people into the expression of those traits?
I think so. Mark Leary, I have immense respect for him. He's a tremendous thinker. And he's right. The original idea was you actually succeed at things and you're successful, competent at your work, and morally good, and so you become confident and able to function and perform. But now there was the self-esteem movement, the concern that children don't have enough self-esteem, and that so we should never criticize them and tell them whatever they do is terrific. And so that unfounded self-esteem that's not rooted in actual achievement, that is more on the pathway to narcissism. So what evidence we have is that levels of narcissism does seem to be increasing in the population over the last few decades, probably due in part to some of the things you talked about, the cultural shift toward we got to tell children to boost them and so on. And the thing is, it's wrong. Children start out with very high self-esteem.
I've got a toddler, I know.
Unless the parent is, is absolutely abusive and really nasty, most children have very positive views of themselves and only gradually come down to normal around the time of puberty and moving into the teen years when they become more self-aware of how others see them and can incorporate a more objective view into their self-views. But yes, children have very, very positive views. So the whole assumption there was mistaken, as is the idea that there's an epidemic of low self-esteem. If you look at all the scales that measure self-esteem and all the samples that do it, so if the range of possible self-esteem scores runs from 0 to 100, say with some measure, so 50 would be the midpoint. But whatever you take a sample of modern adults, the mean, the average is usually more like 60 or 70. So people are objectively above the midpoint. And in fact, there are very few people toward the extreme low end. You'll find if the range of possible self-esteem scores is 0 to 100, you'll certainly have people up there in the 90s, as close to the maximum self-esteem as they can get. And occasionally some do get even a perfect score. They love themselves. but you won't find them down, below 20 or something. They're very few at that end. Most of the scores would be like maybe from 40 to 90. And that changed my understanding of self-esteem too, of what low self-esteem is. It's not thinking you're a bad person. And there are people like that. And especially mental illness might breed some of that. But in the normal population, um, low self-esteem is really the absence of the strong positive view. People with high self-esteem really do think they are good people, competent, superior, and so on. Low self-esteem is not the opposite, thinking that one's a terrible person. It's mostly just the absence. If you look at what they actually say on the questionnaires, it's not, no, I'm terrible. It's that, well, sometimes I'm good, sometimes bad, or I'm not sure. And a lot of responses right in the middle of the scale, which is, of course, how they would end up scoring 50 out of 100 by picking the middle answer. And that we call that low self-esteem because it's in the lower half of the distribution, but it's not really low in an objective sense.
Okay. So in terms of the four roots of evil, you mentioned the means to an end, the egotism and revenge. The next one on the list that you describe in the book is sort of idealist and utopian ideas of what the world should look like.
Yes.
And what we are prepared to do to get to that ideal world.
Yes. And that one was the sad one for me to acknowledge, because people are trying to do what's good, and they think violent means are justified in it. And many of the biggest body accounts throughout history were the result of that, because it's often not an individual, but more of a collective thing. That people together, maybe we can go back to the wars of religion, where people killed other people based on having different ideas of who is God or what is Scripture. Even among the Christians, disagreeing. Well, the Protestants and the Catholics disagreed, and the Albigensian heresy, small disagreements about religious truth set people against each other and killed them, but they thought they were doing God's work by killing the people on the other side. Same in the 20th century, the bloody movements there. We can look at the China purges under Mao Zedong, the Soviet ones under Joseph Stalin, the National Socialists under Hitler, and the Nazis. All of them thought they were trying to make a better society. They had positive goals, and violence was just a means of getting rid of other people who were in the way, who were blocked the progress. So, of course, it was terrible for millions of victims to be killed in awful ways and murdered or executed, in some cases starved to death. Of course, to them, it's evil, and I think we need to recognize it as such. But to understand the psychology of the perpetrators, we have to understand they were often doing what they thought of was a positive good. I think what struck me, I think Robert Conquest's book on the terror famine, if I remember the name right, in the Ukraine under Stalin in the 30s, and they'd had back and forth about. Communism said it should be collective effort, and so they abolished private farms and had the collective farms, which weren't producing enough food, because without individual responsibility, people aren't motivated enough. And then they would let them have their own farms that they could work on one day a week, as long as they worked on the collective farm the rest of the week. But then the private farms were producing more food than the collective farms, even though one day a week. And so Stalin said, all right, well, no more of that. And finally starved them to death, went and confiscated all their food, and millions of people starved to death, which is an awful way to die. Anyway, I remember reading accounts about some young men who took part in that, and they said it was just awful to go into this poor family's house and go through the cupboards and take the last little food that they have while the woman is screaming and the children are crying. And they said, but but we had to tell ourselves that this is what was needed for the revolution to make the paradise, the socialist paradise on earth. And we had to stop our ears and not give in to bourgeois sensitivity of feeling pity for them. And so that really captured for me the inner struggle for people who were hurting people by condemning them to starve to death. And they had the natural human decency that this is a terrible thing, but they had to convince themselves that it is my duty to do that because the world will be a better place because of that, because of my efforts. And it's too bad for these people, but that's necessary part of the revolution that will make the world a fair and equal and flourishing place. So yes, I mean, we see all political stripes and, as I said, religious and various others. Lots of people have been recruited into taking part in evil mass movements by the belief that they were doing good and that that's what was necessary.
I think the really sad thing about the horrors of the 20th century, and I come from Poland, so that was one of the scenes when a lot of that unfolded.
Right, yeah.
And the sad thing that I see in the West is that people really think that we now are different to our ancestors from, let's say, 90, 80 years ago. And I don't think that we are that different. Like, I don't think that we can just look at what's been going on in the communist countries, for example, in Ukraine, in Maoist China, in Germany, and just think we would never do that. And part of the reason, like, let's try and give the devil its due. Let's say that I genuinely believe that if I was to kill 10 people, like, let's select them randomly there, we will bring this ideal world, utopia, it will be amazing, we will cure all cancer. Why would you not kill those 10 people if you genuinely believe that you're saving thousands? Like, there is a hard argument to be made against that. The problem is that we are then assuming that our beliefs are right, that system that we envisage as ideal is indeed ideal. And I think it's that sort of grandiose importance, trying to play God too much, which actually turns people to do some truly horrible acts. And I think the fact that all of these horrors happened in so many places just really should be a bit of the alarm for people that it's not just Germans. There is nothing special about Germans. There is nothing special about Chinese people. There is nothing special about Russians. But then even if you did believe that there is something culturally not quite as moral about these nations as, for example, there would be in nations from the Western world, the few things that are less known in the history is some of the atrocities that, for example, Poles did take part during the Second World War. So there is just horrible mass murder of Jews that was perpetrated by Christians, by Poles, in the small village called Jedwabne, where in one day they've literally, Polish Christians turned on Jews. I think it was in July 1941, and they've literally rounded up all of the Jews from the village and burned them in the barn. There was over 1,000 people that were killed in one day. But Poles are always seen as a victim in the Second World War. But nobody really wanted to look into what would cause a village of people to just turn on their neighbors. There was so much, I think, from the 20th century that we wanted to just forget and to move move past
Yes.
without really trying to understand it.
Yes. Well, when I wrote that book, I read, of course, a lot of the other books on evil, and most of them would sort of focus on the most extreme things. Can you believe this horrible thing this person did? It's incomprehensible how someone could do that. I wanted to have the opposite. I wanted people to read the book and the stories I put in, and so on, that they could say, well, if I were in that situation, maybe I would do that too. Because I think that's the challenge, is what enables ordinary people to get swept up into this. The Poles killing your neighbors, the way the Germans had informed on them and participated in sending them off to their death too. We saw in the 90s several places, Yugoslavia, uh, degenerated into very violent mass killing. Africa, the Rwanda situation. Again, people, I mean, that was especially chilling because people didn't even have guns or whatever. They were sort of taking the cleaver, the knives from their kitchens across the street to kill their
Mm.
neighbors, just to kill them. Um, so that clearly is something that happens, and we have not changed that much. It is still possible in there. The best is the warnings of the past, to realize that the end does not justify the means, no matter how good the end is. Yet modern American university students often still believe this. The morality research now has what they call the trolley problem, which you may have heard of, but it's a dilemma. There's a runaway trolley, and there are five people working on the tracks that are all going to be killed. You can throw the switch and shift the trolley onto a different track, but it will kill someone. It will kill one person. So you're basically killing one to save five. And it corresponds to the example you gave before, that if you killed these 10 people, then lots of others would benefit and be better off. And, well, there's a strong moral case that that's the right thing to do. And many people endorse that and say, yes, I would sacrifice the one to save the five. They say this hypothetically. I don't know that they actually would do this.
Mm-hmm.
In crucial crisis situations like that, people often freeze. Plus, if you take action, you are responsible. I mean, the runaway trolley kills the five people. Well, that's bad. Uh, but if you throw the switch, you would be responsible for the other person's death, including legally as well as morally. So you're quite possibly sacrificing yourself. So when they run these simulations live, people don't quite go along with it, but they at least say, in principle, yes, I think it would be the right thing to do to kill one person to save five other lives.
I think what doesn't help is that there is so many people involved. So, for example, for, let's say, Stalin or Lenin or Mao or Hitler, they were doing the orders, but they were not actually the ones sort of carrying out the most of the atrocities. And sometimes the fact that people at the very top were so far removed from the actual horrors of what was going on at the sort of at the bottom, if you like, and
Yes,
then the people at the bottom not really having the full picture of all the decisions being made at the top, but then also the view of what was happening sort of around them. Back then the information didn't travel the same way that it travels today.
of course.
So maybe there was something where people thought, well, we are not actually killing as many people as we think we are. This is it. This is just that. Like there isn't 20 concentration or death camps in Poland alone. Maybe they didn't actually know that they were taking part in just the sheer scale of it. But that then brings that really interesting interplay of group mentality and the evil that is perpetrated. So, what have you found about that interplay?
Yes, social psychology, we have concept of something of diffusion of responsibility. So no one person feels responsible for it. You think of the Germans killing the Jews there. Um, it wasn't that one bureaucrat woke up and got a machine gun and went over to the Jewish neighborhood and started shooting people down. More the bureaucrat would make out a list that these people need to be sent to the train, and then someone else would deliver the notices, and then some other people would round them up and put them on the train. And then when they arrive at the camp, they'd be sorted into different groups, and and then someone would kill them. But by this point, the process was very far along, and he was just the last in there. So yes, the individual people. I mean, some did, and some felt quite bad about this, but most of them could say, "Well, I'm just a small piece in a giant machine. It's not really my doing," um, and I can't really go against it. I have obligations to do it as well. A wonderful book, wonderful in social science terms. It's a very disturbing book called Ordinary Men. I think it was by
Oh, yeah.
Browning. And this was a group of middle-aged German policemen who were sent to keep order as policemen in occupied Poland. And then one morning, the guy said, "Well, today we have to round up all the Jews and kill them." And this came out of the blue, and none of them knew that this was going to be part of the deal, or that this was happening, or anything like this. So, some of the others say, "Well, they could have refused," and so on. But your buddies, the other policemen there, you're in a foreign country where you're keeping order, and you're dependent on your buddies. If you don't kill the people you're assigned to kill, that just makes more unpleasant work for your friends. You're shirking your duty and putting the burden on them. It's not going to save any lives because they're all going to be killed anyway. And I guess one or two people did occasionally refuse, but you have to understand they're in a very difficult situation. For one thing, suddenly at 6 a.m, and you're told, "All right, today you're going to march people out in the woods and shoot them." Oh my God, you're not prepared for this. You've been brought up to follow orders and do your duty. And if you suddenly get on a moral high horse and say, this is wrong, we shouldn't do this, I object to doing it, you're just making it more difficult for everyone else. And you're making yourself an outcast, the group on which you depend for everything. So, again, this is not to condone these immoral actions. We still have to call them out, but the job as a social scientist to understand the person doing them, and what was it like, and why did people go along and participate in these things. It wasn't the same as if you woke up in the morning and decided, "I'm going to kill some people today. I don't like Jews or whatever other group, so I'm going to go out and murder some." It's not like that at all. It's suddenly being thrust into that duty, and it's an unpleasant duty for sure, especially the first time. I think Browning said that they had nightmares and vomiting and all sorts of reactions. It's very hard on the organism, the human body, to kill another person. Even physically, they couldn't do that. They'd make the Jewish victim lie down on the ground and then hold the gun to shoot them in the head, and then they would miss. They're at point blank range, but they still couldn't bring themselves to do it. And of course, then that victim scream, and it's that much worse. But they're still alive, and you have to do it again. But this was a common problem. These middle-aged men couldn't really bring themselves to do it. As we know, people get desensitized over time. So these same policemen, after they participated in a bunch of those, then they could do it. Not that it was fun, but it was much less disturbing, and the nightmares and the upset stomach and all the other things that attended the first killings diminished. as people continue to do it. And so, yes, people become less and less sensitive to it and are more able to carry out these things. That's just the way the mind is designed.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, if you don't mind me asking a little bit more personal question, like the book, The Ordinary Man, is difficult read, but your book, Evil, is also difficult to sort of stomach because it really puts some uncomfortable facts sort of right in front of you. What was it like for you researching it and then actually writing the book?
There was a bit of desensitization for me, for me too. Um, and I read lots of horrible things and lots of things that initially they were upsetting, but after a while, every so often there'd be something that would still get me. Oh my God! But for the most part, as I sort of developed my conceptual understanding, then those things had less and less emotional impact on me. I remember my wife told the story. It was after dinner, and I'd gone back to work, and I'd come across some story that really fit the theory very well, and I rushed into the kitchen to tell her, and she was doing the dishes, and I thought, this is so fascinating. As look at this happened, and this happened, and she told me later. She said, I was crying when you left. It was such a sad story. It was so horrible for everyone, both the killers and the victims, and so on. But I was completely oblivious to that. It was just sort of how well it understood the theory. Now, the desensitization also wears off. So we have to come back and revisit those things later, or even talking about them today. Then it does bother me again. But while I was immersed in it and reading all these things of mass killings and oppression and the rest, after a while you just become insensitive to it, and so that's what it was like for me.
Mm. I bet you must have been such a cool party guest at the time when it's like, fascinating little stories that you must have been coming up with to your friends around the table.
Yeah, there was a similar. I had an earlier project on sexual masochism. These
Okay, yeah.
being spanked and so on. That is it's one of the classic psychological puzzles. And I read up about it to learn for some book, and it turned out to be irrelevant to that. But it was a big challenge to the self. And I said, well, why do people want to do these things? Like, we know the self wants to maximize esteem, but these people want to be embarrassed and humiliated, and they want to lose control, be tied up. So I read about that, and the same thing. I became fairly desensitized to that, even reading a lot of explicit accounts of people's fantasies and their alleged experiences and so on. But that also wore out. And so later on, I was asked to write another chapter or contribute to a symposium or something. I go back and look at it. Oh, my goodness. But at the time, I just sort of shrugged. I had gotten used to it, and nothing was too extreme there.
I think many people would look at it and sort of think that somehow that's just wrong or evil or like morally not quite where it should be. Like, you shouldn't be able to be desensitized to these things. But I think there is a silver lining to that, because in exactly the same way that we can be desensitized to something horrible that either went on in history or is going on, or for example in a neighboring country, like you can't live your life whilst constantly focusing on it and constantly like being really, really upset and absorbed by it. So at some point your brain is just going to start like fading it into the background. I mean, I was brought up less than 5 miles from one of the famous death camps in Poland. So to us, growing up, that was always in the history. We learned about what was going on in Poland, for example, in Germany, in Ukraine, in Soviet Union from quite early age. So it was difficult to sort of escape that. But I do find it sometimes that Like when I talk about it, like some of my friends are like, like not now, like I've just eaten or something like that.
Yeah.
Like to me, it's because it was always there. Like it doesn't really bother me like as much. It's not like I'm I find joy in it, but like I can stomach it a little bit more. But the silver lining to that is that if something scares us, if we actually keep presenting that scary thing to us, that scary thing will stop being scary. So
Yes. I mean,
there is a bright side to that
yes.
phenomenon.
Yeah. The desensitization is a way that the mind protects itself. And uh, I mean, you can make analogies to changing diapers. A lot of people have a disgust reaction when they do that first, but if you do it after a while, you just get over that, and it becomes, not such an awful thing, and that's fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you felt disgust the first time you change a baby's diaper, and you continue to feel that disgust for all the time that the baby is in diapers for a couple of years, well, that would be very hard on you.
Yeah.
I think that the babies would have a lot more dirty diapers because they wouldn't get changed nearly as often. Uh, so, uh,
So
so it has useful traits. I mean, I
yeah.
respect the moral thing that we shouldn't just because we become familiar with things, we shouldn't cease to see them as wrong and as evil. But the emotional reaction will certainly die down.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to the sort of utopians and idealists, I think that it's another one of these where it's the altruism or trying to do good that is being essentially hijacked by then being able or capable or becoming capable of doing truly horrendous things. But given that people are not inherently like born evil, what is the process that they kind of need to go through, or like an example of the process where they become capable of carrying out these atrocities?
Well, let's see. That was a little bit harder to get at. But for one thing, the desensitization has to be part of it. I remember reading. There's not a lot of great information about this, but people who work as torturers, professional torturers, usually working for the government in some repressive regime, they have to be brought around to do it. And at first, of course, hurting another person really goes against their psychology. So there's education to think of the other person as somehow less than human. So it isn't really as bad as hurting a genuine human being or a good human being. They often are subjected to some mild torture themselves, so they get used to the idea of pain. Well, you can endure it. Um, and then they sit in on some sessions and get used to hearing people scream and be put in pain and so on. And so they gradually come around to being able to do it themselves. They become more again desensitized. They see it as a positive good. The explanation that this is your duty and you're protecting our country from its enemies. You're helping. You're doing good for a lot of people by harming these bad people. Um, so we have some clues to the process
Mm-hmm.
from that. One of the interesting things I read and came across was, you're supposed to torture people but not kill them. It's usually presented as trying to get information, but sometimes they do get carried away and kill the person. But it's not usually the beginners who do that. It's the old hands who are more likely to get carried away. Because I would thought, okay, well, a rookie mistake. You don't know how much pain to give, and you give a little too much, and you kill the person. That'd be something that would happen in the first year, but the expert
Mm-hmm.
would know better. But it seemed to go the other way, partly because they get more desensitized and more indifferent to the victim. They get used to hearing people suffer, and it's a challenge for them. Oh, this one's resisting. We can really do something to make them squeal, and we'll try something harder. And so they're more prone to get carried away. Again, it was contrary to what we might intuitively think.
And I think that will then sort of take us gently to the fourth root of evil.
Yes.
And that one is interesting because this is where I think it's for most people, that one is going to be the most difficult to understand. And that's sadism, or essentially taking pleasure and delight of other people's suffering. So what do we know about sadism?
That was very hard to get at. In fact, I was reluctant to have that be the fourth root. I wasn't sure it existed, and I learned, on the sexual thing, which is different with the sadomasochism. There are a lot more people who want to be the submissive than the dominant. They have clubs for those people who want to play these games together, but there's always a surplus of submissives. So even there seems to be a shortage, and a lot of the people who do become dominant are sort of converted. They started out as submissives and then moved on. So I wondered how common it was. There are very few people who admit to having pleasure themselves, but I kept coming across accounts where somebody wrote about taking part in some mass murder campaign, and he said, well, it was hard on me, but I did see a couple of the others seem to enjoy it, and they talked about it or even admitted it was starting to be satisfying. There were enough of those, so I concluded that is real. It's not a big source in terms of the high body count. That goes more with the threatened egotism or the means to an end, or the especially the idealistic evil. But of course, if you're the victim of a sadist, it's much the worse for you because they want to enjoy your suffering. I mean, if they just want your money, they might beat you up to get your money, but you give them your money, then they're done. They don't need to beat you up anymore. But if they're getting pleasure from beating you up, you can give them your money, you can give them anything, they'll still want to beat you up and carry it to an extreme. So it's worse for the victim. And my sense is it's a bit derivative of the others. It's something that develops slowly. You don't usually start out that way, but gradually over time you become desensitized. There's this theory in psychology called the opponent process theory, and I adapted that to explain sadism. The opponent process is how your body maintains its homeostasis, its equilibrium. So let's say if you're out of shape, you run up a flight of stairs, and then your heart will start beating faster. Well, it doesn't go on beating faster for the rest of your life. There's processes that speed it up. And then after a while, there are other processes that slow it back down to get back to normal. So and over time, as you continue to run up the stairs, if you did it every day, the speeding up will gradually get weaker, and the opponent process that calms down again will happen faster. So, the first time you run up 2 flights of stairs, you might be breathing hard for 10 minutes. But after you've been doing it a lot and you're in shape, you might breathe hard for half a minute or something, but pretty fast it restores. So the restoring process gets better. It's how, for example, why do people like bungee jumping? Falling is one of the most basic fears in the mind. It's extremely natural. But so you fall, you have this moment of terror, and then to get rid of the terror, the body releases positive chemicals, and so you have some positive emotion that gradually restores it. And as you continue to go bungee jumping, again, the moment of terror will get shorter, and the bliss gets longer. So it becomes more and more fun and satisfying. And I was thinking, well, that's kind of what maybe happens with sadism. The initial reaction to hurting someone, killing someone is really negative. Again, it goes against the grain to do that. but at some point the body provides positive feelings to help you get over it. And if you do it a fair amount, if you kill a bunch of people, then gradually the initial horror and disgust that go with it will diminish, and the pleasure that comes later will become more intense, and then you might actually feel it. And I'd say further, most people have enough of a conscience that they wouldn't allow themselves to acknowledge that they enjoyed it,
Mm-hmm.
even if this might be a natural thing. But people with a weaker sense of guilt or whatever, they might not be deterred by that. Or people who really do see their victims as less than human, as another lower form of humanity, so it's really not a problem. They might allow themselves to enjoy it. So that you would get about what you get is that a lot of people participate in violence, but only a few come to really enjoy it, and it usually looks like something they learned over time. I remember
Yeah.
reading about the mass murderers. I read all kinds of terrible things, and that not the mass murderers, the serial killers. The FBI has tracked these, and there are several books they've written about them. And often, this is somebody, it's usually a man, who has worked out this fantasy of what it would be like to kill someone. And it becomes a very compelling dream. And so finally he does it. And the reality is very different from how he imagined it. And it's disgusting. And he feels awful about it and sick. And so he's killed somebody. But he goes home really shaken, and he says, I'm not going to do that again. So there's a strong negative reaction the first time. But in some cases, after a while, he says, well, maybe it was bad because I didn't do it just right. So I got to try it again and do it better, and it'll be better this time. And he tries a few times and then starts to get that desensitization, or that reduced initial reaction, the reduced disgust, and starts to feel the pleasure and satisfaction afterwards. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
leads a few of them to go on and kill multiple people over time. But the first reaction is usually, even for them, quite negative, at least from the
Yeah.
memoirs we have and the interviews.
That's really fascinating. I think one thing that really surprised me in your book was you had a pretty good predictive powers back then. So when you wrote your book about towards the end, you were talking about the future of evil. You pointed to the right places on the international level. So you mentioned about Russia being one of the main threats due to the history. You were talking about China, and obviously now fast forwarding 25 years, those they're certainly seen as the sort of the big threats to the current order. So
Well, China
given
and Russia have taken very different trajectories, and China is prospering, is taking care of its people, and so I don't see that on a par with Russia's invading their neighbors and sending people to carry out murders in other countries
mhm.
and so on. But I'd forgotten I had predictions about the future of evil in that book, but I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, so but just sort of wondering, given the changes that we've seen in the sort of last 20 years, 15 years with regards to the culture wars, and how just ideologies are changing, the renewed romanticism for the communist or socialist ideas, like, have you got a sense of like the threats in our sort of modern life and the future of evil in the modern sense?
Oh, this is not something I have thought about for a while. Um, the I'd want to think about that before I certainly don't want to call anyone evil in the modern world without carefully considering all sides to it. I know people in the United States, we have a political polarization, and the two parties are demonizing each other. I think rather unfortunately and unhelpfully. I think they both mean to do well by our society. Uh, as best they can, and they have maybe slightly different visions of what that would be to do well. So it would be, if there is evil, it's in the category of using destructive means for what they see as good ends. I mean, I've spent my life at universities, and many universities are now stifling freedom of speech and what people are allowed to say. Again, this is motivated by positive ideals. I think it's still a bad move. We should let people think and say what they want, as long as they aren't explicitly hurting anyone else. And they should be allowed to criticize other people too. That's allowed. And so there's canceling of speakers and stifling. That's a very ominous trend in our society, and will lead to more like-minded people, especially if one party manages to seize control over a long period of time. One party rule tends to be quite destructive almost everywhere. The successful, flourishing countries in the world, with a few exceptions, China is certainly flourishing under the one party rule for a long period of time. Big China and tiny Singapore. But in most places, the longer you have one party rule, the more things tend to go downhill. The flourishing countries we've seen in the UK and the US and Germany and France and others, Scandinavians and so on, they tend to have alternation in power. But I think when one party holds power for a long time, they start to think that they are right and they are entitled to stifle the opposition, and that then becomes quite clearly oppressive.
And then your latest work is all about free will. Now, there's been a lot of academics with big names, Robert Sapolsky, that wrote their books about free will and the belief that it essentially doesn't exist. So I was wondering whether you might give us like your take on free will and how do you see it? And then if indeed the free will doesn't exist, what does it mean for the existence of evil? Because if people haven't got no control over what they do, how can we hold them accountable
Yes,
for what they
people clearly
do?
have control over what they do. And so my book is a strong positive case for free will, which others are making. I talked to Sapolsky. I had an online debate with him a while ago. He and many of the scientists who say there's no free will, they define it in a really extreme fashion, that you have to be independent of all external factors and all prior events. And why would that even exist? If you define it that way, I don't believe in it either. But the ability to act differently in the same situation, this has hugely adaptive. This we do have, and this is important. So even the critics of free will, even the skeptics, agree that the way that the human mind controls behavior, because that's essentially what we're talking about, something in the mind, in the brain, that dictates how the body moves, what you do, and what you say. So there's some kind of freedom in there. So even the skeptics who deny free will, they usually acknowledge that the human system for controlling action is vastly different from anything else in nature. So evolution created a new system in us, which is why our lives are so different from chimpanzees, who, after all, don't have language, go naked, sleep outdoors, get wet when it rains. They don't have this, let alone technology that enables us to have a conversation thousands of kilometers apart on intellectual topics. So the human system is different. That, to me, is the challenge, the scientific challenge. Let's understand what is this marvelous new psychological capacity that humans have evolved, which nobody seems to deny is quite real. So they're just debating whether this deserves to be called free will. If you define free will as based on the soul coming into the brain and causing behavior. Well, as I said, I don't believe in that either. Um, but if you look at it as an advanced form of flexible behavior, that makes perfect sense. Evolution rewards flexibility in behavior. I mean, that's what learning is. And learning is very adaptive. It starts with very simple animals can learn. But that learning is being able to have a different response or a better response to a particular situation. So we've taken that up to another level, a much more advanced degree. So my book on free will focuses on how does this marvelous new action control system in the human mind operate. There are things like we have a much more sophisticated understanding of time. Oh, I suppose I should say too, in terms of the term, if you're just arguing about does this marvelous new action control system deserve to be called free will? Well, for me, the free is pretty well justified. The will part is more of a problem for me. We don't have a psychology of will. If you buy any modern psychology textbook, there's no chapter on the will. The will part is a metaphor. But freedom, we're certainly free. And the other thing, sometimes the skeptics and the strict philosophers and so on want it to be all or nothing. But in psychology, almost everything's on a continuum. I mean, we talked about self-esteem, and we talk about high and low self-esteem, but it's not that there are two types. If you measure people's self-esteem, they're just along a continuum, with most people clustered in the middle. And so freedom is kind of the same thing. When we ask people, tell an action from your life when you acted of your own free will, and tell a case when you didn't act of your own free will. Everybody's able to do this. Everybody knows the experience. Some actions are freer than others. So the free part, I think, is scientifically sound, as long as we don't require the absolute extreme, the way Sapolsky wanted to, has to be completely unaffected by any prior event or external cause. Because I said, what is for that? The human mind evolved so we could participate in culture. Culture is how our species solves the problems of how to continue life by surviving and reproducing. And culture means you have to respond all the more to the environment. There are rules and roles and expectations and standards. So there's no value in being able to act in a completely random fashion. And culture doesn't even like random behavior. The thing I say in the book is, would you hire a plumber who did random things to your plumbing? Or a surgeon who's going to operate on your child, who's going to do random things? Would you want that? No, you don't want random things. You want them to fix the problem exactly according to standard procedures. That's what free will is for the human version, the flexible behavior to understand the specific problem and give the optimal response to that. So in terms of some of the capacities, the ability to project into the future. I mean, most animals just live in the present. A few of them can have expectancies a few minutes into the future. The smartest ones, maybe the chimpanzees, they suggest up to 20 minutes. They can plan ahead, like by carrying along a stick that they might use as a tool in the place they're going to look for food. But that's about it. Whereas we've scheduled this conversation a month in advance, and people make airplane reservations and restaurant reservations and plan for the future and save for buying a house or for their children's education or for their retirement. We're able to project much farther into the future. That makes us freer than animals who cannot do that, who just live in the here and now. So that would be one component, and I go through a number of these, the ability for conscious thought and to apply ideas, to allow ideas to guide behavior. Some of the things we're talking about, for better and for worse, like the idealists who think, the world would be a better place if I kill all the people who have a different religion or a different political belief. So that's not good, but that's still using free will and having ideas enter into the causation of behavior rather than just reacting to the immediate situation. Anyway, that's my take on it, and I'm trying to do it. I wanted to basically reframe the problem as a scientific problem. How does this thing work, rather than Does it deserve to be called free will or not? It's close enough.
Okay.
If it were discovered today, we probably wouldn't call it free will. We might use a different term, but given that the term's been in use for 1,000 years, we should probably keep it. It is close enough.
Okay, so your book, The Science of Free Will, is out in States now. It will be out in the UK soon, I believe. Is it November the 6th?
I don't know the exact date, but it sounds something like that. It's Oxford University Press, and so the Oxford website, I'm sure, will say people could pre-order it now if they want.
No problem. Well, I'll make sure that I'll link to your book, which is essentially a positive take on free will and on your work on evil. In terms of where can people find you to follow your work, where can they go and find more about you?
There's a website, roybaumeister.com. Other people maintain it for me. It's a little bit behind the latest, but it has a lot of information there, and I think they do a nice job of it. That's as good a place as any.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Roy Baumeister.
Okay, well, thank you, Kat.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.